Na mtakuwa narejea ndani muda usiokuwa mrefu huko kwenye kaunti ya Nyeri tuweze kuzungumza na Clement Masombo ambaye yuko huko na anaendelea kufuatilia tamasha hizo. Lakini kwa sasa niungane na mwanahabari mwenzangu Zubeda Kome ambapo yupo kwenye kaunti ya Uasin Gishu mjini Eldoret akiendelea kufuatilia kwa ukaribu kongamano la ugatuzi likiwa limeingia siku ya 4 tukitarajia likamiliki hapo kesho. Leo tunasubiria kuwepo kwa vile hotuba ya kinara wa upinzani Raila Odinga kuhutubia kikao hicho cha kongamano la viongozi mbalimbali wakiwemo wa kimataifa. Zubeda, tutarajie nini leo katika kongamano la ugatuzi tukiwa tunasubiria ile hotuba ya Raila Odinga ambaye ni kiongozi wa upinzani?
Okay, sawa.
Oh, already wamefika. Asante sana mtazamaji. Sasa hivi kinara wa Azimio Raila Odinga ameweza kuwasili katika eneo hili na tutakuwa tukielekea upande huo, lakini tuzungumze kwa ufupi sana na kwa mapana na mheshimiwa Eugene Wamalwa. Asante sana kwa kuzungumza nasi. Tutarajie nini? Kinara wa Azimio amewasili.
Nafikiri kwanza tunafuraha sana kuwa hapa siku ya leo na baba wa ugatuzi mheshimiwa Raila Odinga, na tumeambatana naye na magavana na viongozi kutoka sehemu mbalimbali kuja kusherehekea ugatuzi katika taifa letu. Ni miaka 10 tangu tuanze mfumo huu wa ugatuzi na tumepiga hatua, na siku ya leo ni kuja kujiuliza miaka 10, je, ugatuzi umebadilisha maisha Kenya ama bado? Na kuna changamoto zipi ambazo tunaweza tukaendelea kukumbana nazo? Yes.
Na umewahi kuwa katika sekta hii, idara hii ya ugatuzi. Wewe binafsi umeona ni changamoto zipi ambazo zimekuwepo kwa miaka 10 ambayo ugatuzi umekuwepo?
Nafikiri changamoto kubwa kwa ugatuzi, na naweza sema adui mkuu wa ugatuzi, ni ufisadi. Sababu nia yetu ilikuwa ni kudevolve mamlaka na pesa zije mashinani kubadilisha maisha na kuboresha maisha ya Wakenya, lakini in the process tulidevolve ufisadi. Na lazima tuone vile tunaweza kabiliana na ufisadi ili pesa zinazokuja mashinani ziweze kubadilisha maisha ya Wakenya, kuboresha maisha ya Wakenya, na ufisadi bado adui mkubwa wa ugatuzi katika taifa letu. Asante.
Na asante sana, na ni swala ambalo rais aliweza kulizungumzia jana. Naona mnataka kukimbia kule muweze kumlaki kinara wa Azimio. Lakini tutakuwa tukija, mheshimiwa, dakika moja unaweza kusema neno moja kuhusiana na kikao hiki cha leo na tutarajie nini?
Leo ni siku ya kusherehekea miaka 10 ya ugatuzi. Kuna mengi ambayo imetendeka, lakini pia kuna mengi ambayo imebaki, kwa sababu ugatuzi ndio hasa chombo cha kuimarisha maendeleo katika mashinani. Mengi imetendeka, lakini pia serikali lazima itie nguvu zaidi. Lazima tuone kile chochote ambacho kilikuwa kipelekwe kuwa ni function ya mashinani iende, na pia mambo ya pesa. Kwa hivyo ukitaka kutatua shida ya ajira Kenya, shida ya chakula Kenya, kila shida Kenya lazima itatuliwe kupitia kwa ugatuzi. Kwa hivyo hii story yote inapeanwa bila kupatia ugatuzi nguvu. Hakuna ajira, hakuna ujenzi wa manyumba na njaa itaendelea. Kwa hivyo mimi ningeuliza pesa nyingi zaidi zitengwe, ziende katika sekta ya ugatuzi na pia zitumike kwa njia mwafaka.
Asante sana mheshimiwa. Naona mna mbio na muona kinara wa Azimio amewasili. Mtazamaji, bado tuko katika mji wa Eldoret, kaunti ya Uasin Gishu, ambako kuna adhimisho miaka 10 tangu ugatuzi kuanza, na naona viongozi mbalimbali tayari wamewasili. Kinara wa Azimio ameenda kulakiwa sasa hivi. Tutakuwa tukikupeleka kule moja kwa moja upate kuona picha mbashara kutoka mji huu wa Eldoret. Tunasubiri kusikia atakachokisema kwa Kenya. Nikurejeshe studio kwa dakika moja tuelekee mahala ambapo kinara wa Azimio amefika sasa hivi, kisha tutakuletea picha hizo muda usiokuwa mrefu.
Na kama alivyosema mwenzangu Zubeda Kome, tupo pale kwenye kaunti ya Uasin Gishu mjini Eldoret. Tumekita kambi, hatung'oki hadi kongamano hilo litakapokamilika kesho. Sasa hivi ndani ya muda usiokuwa mrefu, muda wote kutokea sasa, takuwa tunakurejesha kule tuweze kupata hotuba ya kinara wa upinzani Raila Odinga ambaye anatarajiwa kuzungumza hii leo katika kongamano hilo. Kumbuka jana Rais William Ruto alitoa hotuba yake kama kuzindua rasmi kongamano hilo na kuzungumzia masuala mbalimbali kuhusiana na safari ya miaka 10 ya ugatuzi. Na leo tutakuwa tunatarajia vile kusikia kutoka kwa kiongozi wa upinzani akiwa ni miongoni mwa viongozi ambao katika historia walikuwa wanapigania ugatuzi na kuzaliwa kwa ugatuzi. Tuvuke huko moja kwa moja tupate kujua yanayojiri sasa hivi.
level of 720 billion, which is now what we call the budget deficit, it is also some form of financing of the budget. However, this figure may not, is a small figure comparatively, because last year we were dealing with a deficit of around 860 billion, and there were other expenditures at the 223 to a tune of 300 billion. And therefore, the actual deficit we were actually dealing with in the last financial year was much more, because it was around 1.1 trillion. Now, that is where we are drawing our resources. And the reason I've highlighted is because the first item I gave, which is the ordinary revenue, is actually that what forms the basis of equitable share. Now, on the expenditure side of the 3.744 trillion, we have 2.3 trillion, which is the expenditure of the national government. National government here incorporates the judiciary and also the parliament. Parliament, that is both houses. And out of which 1.5 trillion is actually monies that are recurrent in nature, is expenditure that is recurrent. We have around 807 billion, which is development kitty or development budget of the entire national government. From there, we have 986 billion, which is consolidated fund services, which is repayment of debts, and also the allocations that we give to our commissions and also pensions. And then lastly, we have now what we are discussing here today, which is the county monies or resources, which the equitable share is around 385 billion Kenya shillings. Now, the reason I've tabulated both is because each of those figures and lines have ramifications for governance and how our counties are run. The reason why the government affords the amount of money, for example, we are affording to channel to our county governments, is also based on the other budget lines that have to actually precede even the monies that we give to our counties. If you look at the side of the expenditure, how Treasury works and how also we work in the budget committee, this kitty I gave of 986 billion, called the consolidated fund services, actually forms the first charge. When the Treasury collects money, the first batch of money they must release is the monies which are obligatory in nature, and that which forms the first obligation, the repayment of debts. How is debt related? Out of the 3.7 trillion, the first, in terms of the size that we are actually expending as a country, which is now beyond the salaries of the civil servants, is actually CFS, majority of which is payments for interest of our debts, which are the sovereign debts. So we may be discussing later about how to make the slice of the cake that goes to our counties bigger, but it must be in the context of all the things that we are doing as a government and also as a committee, so that our counties can get more money. If we free up more money, if for example we are not paying CFS of close to 1 trillion, then that frees up a lot of resources, out of which some may be retained in the national government, but of course a share of it will also go to our counties. As I come to the close, I will highlight the circumstances of the macro environment. The macro environment at which we are now operating on, I have to say, is much better than last year. Last year, I remember when we were starting the budget making process, we were discussing it at a circumstance where we had a ravaging famine, and therefore the first priority was actually more interventionist than policy. We had to intervene for the people of Kenya to remain alive first, even before we talked about the policies of making our country better. But there are also some glaring issues that we are facing as a country, and all these I've said before have the ramifications to the monies that we are discussing. Number one is there has been a global inflation, and I want to highlight, number one, the inflation that has been there in the US, basically as a result of what we would call COVID checks, which was an intervention of the US government. So every time the Federal Reserve have been raising interest rates, we have been seeing ramifications across our currency, across our debt, and across everything else that is attached to it. We have also been seeing a lot of capital flight, because when the US interest rate goes up, then the US becomes a very attractive area for investments, and especially for people who will be looking for fixed income kind of facilities, and therefore we get capital flights from the markets in the emerging countries like Kenya, and that has got a lot of effect to everything else, including inflation, including our currency. Lastly, I am happy that now inflation is coming much lower, because I saw the last figures from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, where in the previous month, the food inflation part was around 8.6%, which is a climb down, because you've been talking about even in excess of 15% in the last few months. And when food inflation comes down, then generally the cost of life goes down, and I'm sure even the political noise comes down, and this gives a good environment for people to work and especially implement policies that are long-term in nature. Sorry for the jargons, but I'm sure we will ease up as we proceed.
Really appreciated, Honorable Dendi. That was a fantastic breakdown. I think we've been schooled a little bit on the breakdown, especially budgeting process, and I like the fact that you touched on the macroeconomic circumstances. Just following up on that, because we are now at the budget and allocation to counties. We've come from 3.74 billion up to where we've allocated counties 385 billion. With devolution, service delivery is largely now a task, or is primarily undertaken by counties. And Your Excellency, Governor of Kakamega, just help us paint the picture of how this disparity in the budget allocation is affecting service delivery.
Thank you very much, Session Chair. When you look at the budget allocation between the national government and the counties, we actually have disparities which grossly affects service delivery. And this is in line with the fact that most of those functions which were devolved under the fourth schedule of the Constitution were not costed properly. We have one of the principles of fiscal responsibility, which requires resources to follow functions. So if we have functions that have been devolved and not properly costed, then it becomes a problem, or rather pressure on the counties to adequately finance those specific functions which were devolved. So the effect of the disparity, because of the low allocation to counties, number one, we're going to see a reduced access to basic services. For example, the allocation that you are given in this financial year is only an increase of 15 billion Kenya shillings. When you take 15 billion Kenya shillings, divide into 47 counties, you'll clearly do the maths and see that that increase may not be adequate. Yes, we understand that the cake is not big enough, but I think the service delivery at the counties, especially on matters to do with healthcare, education, may be affected because the amount that you have received, which was not properly costed at the time of disbursement or other devolvement, affects service delivery. When you go to education sector, there's so many expectations of the counties to deliver ECD programs, and ECD was devolved, but we didn't have attendant resources. On the issues of roads infrastructure, for example, we have so much that is expected from the counties, especially on the infrastructure, but because the cake is limited, so it is going to affect the growth of our projections in terms of infrastructure, in terms of growth of our service delivery. And that is why, going forward, you'll find that we're asking the Commission on Revenue Allocation to look at the effects of the disparity so that at the next disbursement, they make recommendations to the National Treasury. Again, because of the reduced disbursement and allocation to counties, you will find there is also pressure on the counties to maximize on revenue allocation, or rather revenue generation. Of course, that becomes an opportunity for the counties to do what we call diversification of revenues, but ideally it's because of the disparity. I appreciate what the Chair of Budget has pointed out, but what we are saying is let the functions which have been devolved to have the resources. We'll want to see an implementation of what the President said yesterday, that in the next 60 days, all those devolved functions which are still being undertaken by the national government are going to be devolved. And then resources, attendant resources, to follow those functions. Lastly, Chair, we are looking at overdependence on conditional grants because of the disparity and also because of the challenge of inadequate resourcing of counties. These conditional grants, of course, largely come with conditionality, especially from the development partners, which may not necessarily be compatible with our local needs. So what we are saying is we are looking forward to a balanced and equitable allocation of resources so that service delivery is properly achieved. Of course, taking cognizance of the fact that we have resource constraints, we are very much alive to that fact, and largely, once we comply with the fiscal responsibility principle of resources following functions, then we can clearly see an improved service delivery to counties. Thank you.
Very much, Your Excellency. Very well captured on the key challenges. And I noticed that you focus largely on the vertical allocation. Allow me to go to the Honorable CS. Professor, we've heard from David, or Dindi Nyoro, sorry, and the Governor, and the real issue here is disparity. Kindly help us reflect on why this disparity exists. Professor.
Thank you very much. And because this question was sent to be earlier, I'll make sure that I have a comprehensive answer. Because I don't have one answer, I have a series of should I say, factors that we put together. But before I do that, let me appreciate the 10 years of devolution and even the theme that has been chosen, that we can drive transformation from the local county governments as centers of economic development. And it resonates quite well with the bottom-up economic transformation agenda. One of the things I've told people so many times is that it's an agenda with two distinct statements. One of them is bottom-up. And you have to ask yourself why majority of Kenyans have been left behind. And we have to ask ourselves whether it's a resource constraint or it's an institutional constraint, an institutional failure problem that drives policy failure. And the second one is economic transformation. And one of the most important things is actually to ask ourselves what ignites economic transformation. And that is one of the reasons why devolution was very, very important. So essentially, we are coming to the point where we not only give ourselves a scorecard in terms of economic transformation, but also how we try to eradicate poverty. So since I was tasked this question, let me try to provide some answers. One of them is that, let me start by saying that the objective of the revenue, in the division of revenue between the two levels of government is equitable sharing of the same to ensure that each level is able to perform the function assigned to it by the Constitution. I think His Excellency, Mheshimiwa Dindi Nyoro has actually voiced that and tried to redefine that across institutions and across levels. And also to underscore what I think.
Tutakuwa tunarejea huko ndani